In the small industrial town of Cresswell, the world awoke each morning to a symphony of subtle sounds and scents. The cobblestone streets, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, glimmered faintly in the first light, their uneven surfaces catching the sun's gentle warmth as it filtered through a lattice of autumn branches. The air was crisp, tinged with the promise of rain that sometimes never came, and with it travelled the aroma of fresh bread drifting from the bakery at the corner where the day's first batch cooled in the open window. Somewhere, a factory whistle pierced the quiet, its call echoing across rooftops and alleyways, signalling the start of another day's labour. Cresswell was a town of contrasts, of brick facades, stone cottages, and grand houses that stood behind iron gates. In the early morning, a thin mist clung to the riverbanks, blurring the strict lines that separated one life from another, if only for a fleeting moment. Along the eastern edge of town, where the workers' houses clustered close, garden plots overflowed with late autumn cabbages and asters, their colours muted by the season but tended with patient hands. The sound of laughter, muffled by closed windows, spoke of families who found comfort in one another, even as the world pressed in. It was in one of these modest homes that Clara lived, her days unfolding to the rhythm of necessity and hope. She was the daughter of a machinist. Her father, Emile, had spent decades inside the walls of the textile mill until his hands grew stiff and his back bowed. Now Clara cared for her mother, Greta, who had grown frail and forgetful, her memory fading like the old photographs that lined their mantel. Theirs was a home where every corner carried the imprint of hard-working years, where the wooden floors creaked with stories and the curtains smelled faintly of lavender and sun. Clara moved through her mornings with a kind of quiet efficiency. Her hands were deft, scrubbing laundry in a cracked porcelain basin, mending seams by the window where the light was best. She had learned to be resourceful, to make do, to find a certain dignity in small acts. A vase of wildflowers on the table, a loaf of bread stretched to last another day. Yet beneath her steady exterior, there lived a restlessness, a yearning that hummed just below her skin. Sometimes in the stillness before dawn or the hush after supper, she would catch herself staring out the window, heart beating with dreams too big to name. Clara's world was bordered by duty and affection, but her imagination reached further. She read whatever novels she could borrow from the church library, devouring stories of distant lands and unexpected fortunes, her mind travelling far beyond the confines of Cresswell. She wondered what it might feel like to walk streets where nobody knew her name, to be more than the machinist's daughter, to choose her own path instead of tracing the one laid out before her. These thoughts felt both thrilling and dangerous, as though by daring to wish for more she might lose what little she had. On the opposite side of town, behind wrought iron gates and a long gravel drive, stood the Ashcroft house, a grand, imposing structure with ivy creeping up its stone walls and windows that always seemed just a little too clean. Here lived Julian, the only son of the mill's owner, in rooms that echoed with silence and the scent of polished wood. The house, though beautiful, had a kind of loneliness to it, as if each ornate chair and gilded frame existed more for show than comfort. Julian's life was shaped by expectations as much as privilege. His father, Leonard Ashcroft, had built his fortune from the ground up, turning a modest weaving shed into the heart of Cresswell's industry. Leonard believed in hard work, in discipline, in the idea that every generation must improve upon the last. For Julian, this translated to a childhood spent in shadowed rooms with tutors and etiquette lessons. His laughter kept quiet, his curiosity carefully channeled into respectable pursuits. Even now, as a young man, the weight of legacy pressed upon Julian's shoulders, a reminder that his life was not entirely his own. Despite the comforts that surrounded him, Julian felt a persistent ache, a sense of being out of place in his own skin. He longed for something more than inherited duty and polite conversation over bone china. Sometimes, late at night, he would slip from his room and walk the grounds, letting the night air fill his lungs, searching for a sense of belonging that always seemed just out of reach. He envied the easy camaraderie of the workers, the warmth that radiated from their gatherings, even as he knew he would always be apart. His mother, Marianne, was gentle and distant, her attention often turned inward or toward the endless rounds of charity work she organized. Julian had learned to navigate the silences between them, to read the meaning in a glance, or the comfort in a hand resting briefly on his shoulder. Still, he wondered if anyone truly saw him, the boy who preferred books to business, who found solace in painting watercolors by the river, who wished he could step outside the lines drawn for him. In the quiet hours of the morning, Julian would sometimes wander into his father's study, tracing his fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes, breathing in the scent of old paper and ink. He imagined a different future, one where he might travel, write, or simply exist without the constant pressure to prove himself. Yet guilt always crept in, reminding him of the sacrifices his family had made, the responsibilities he could not ignore. His heart was a landscape of contradictions, longing and loyalty, hope and resignation, stitched together by the threads of expectation. The town itself seemed to sense the undercurrents running through its people. Each day the sun rose over the smokestacks, bathing the rooftops in gold before the haze of labor settled in. The marketplace bustled with vendors hawking apples and potatoes, the church bells marking the passage of time with their measured toll. People greeted one another with nods and smiles, their faces etched with the stories of years spent together. Yet beneath the surface, boundaries held, lines drawn not just by wealth but by history and habit, by the invisible rules that governed who belonged where. Clara and Julian moved through these parallel worlds, their paths never quite crossing, though the distance between them was measured in little more than streets and circumstance. On certain mornings, Julian would pass by the rows of workers' cottages on his way to the mill, his gaze lingering on the gardens and the laughter spilling through open doors. He wondered about the lives unfolding there, the struggles and joys he could only guess at. Meanwhile, Clara would catch glimpses of the Ashcroft carriage rattling down the avenue, its polished wood gleaming in the sunlight, and feel a mixture of curiosity and defiance rise in her chest. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, yet both carried within them a spark, a stubborn belief that things could be different, that happiness might be found in defiance of expectation. For Clara, it was the memory of her father's stories, told in low tones over the whir of the sewing machine, of people who had dared to dream, who had made their own luck. For Julian, it was the echo of his mother's lullabies, sung in French on nights when he couldn't sleep, promising that the world was wide and full of possibility. As autumn deepened, the town changed with the season. Leaves gathered in golden drifts against the fences. The river ran slow and silver under the clouded sky, and the air grew sharp with the scent of wood smoke. Within each home, preparations for winter began. Jars of preserves lined up on shelves, blankets aired out and patched, shoes mended for another year. The rhythm of life continued, steady as the ticking of the clock in the town square. Yet something quiet was shifting beneath the surface, an anticipation that neither Clara nor Julian could name. Perhaps it was the way the days grew shorter, the nights longer and filled with dreams, or perhaps it was the way small moments began to matter more. A smile exchanged with a neighbor, the comfort of a familiar song, the warmth of hands clasped around a mug of tea. In these gentle rituals, hope flickered, fragile and persistent. Clara found herself pausing more often at the window, watching the world go by, her thoughts wandering to what might lie beyond the edge of town. She noticed the way the light changed in the afternoons, slanting across the kitchen table and casting patterns on the worn floorboards. She wondered if anyone else felt the same restless ache, the same longing for something unnamed. At night she would sit by her mother's bedside, listening to Greta's soft breathing, and promise herself that tomorrow she would be braver, that she would find a way to shape her own destiny. Julian too felt the ripples of change. He began to linger in the village square after his errands, watching the children play, the vendors barter, the old men share stories on the benches. He saw kindness in the smallest gestures, a loaf of bread shared, a door held open, a handkerchief pressed into a friend's palm. These moments reminded him that life's meaning was not always found in grand gestures, but in the quiet accumulation of care. One afternoon, as the sky threatened rain and the wind tugged playfully at her scarf, Clara set out for the bookshop that sat nestled between the bakery and the tailor's. It was a small, cramped place, its shelves overflowing with volumes old and new, the air thick with the scent of paper and ink. She loved the bookshop for its quiet, for the way the owner, Mr. Fenwick, always greeted her with a nod and a gentle smile, never asking for more than she could give. As she stepped inside, the bell above the door tinkled softly, and the golden light from the window danced in the dust motes that floated lazily through the air. Clara moved between the shelves, trailing her fingertips along the spines, searching for a story that might carry her away for an hour or two. Hello, beautiful romantic soul. Before we begin today's story, I invite you to subscribe and like so we can continue sharing these heartfelt tales together. And tell me in the comments, from which corner of the world are you listening tonight? Across town, Julian found himself drawn to the same bookshop, compelled by a need he could not quite name. He arrived just as a light rain began to fall, the droplets tapping out a gentle rhythm on the awning above the door. Shrugging off his coat, he stepped inside, grateful for the warmth and the hush that greeted him. The familiar scent of old books wrapped around him like a comfort. Julian's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and he moved quietly between the rows, careful not to disturb the fragile peace. He paused at a table stacked with poetry, his fingers tracing the embossed title of a slim volume. As he reached for the book, his hand brushed against another, a smaller, rougher hand, pale from the cold. Startled, Clara drew back, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She looked up to find Julian's gaze fixed on hers, his eyes a clear, steady blue that seemed at once apologetic and amused. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft rustle of pages and the distant patter of rain. Clara's first instinct was to withdraw, to shield herself behind the familiar armor of reserve. She recognized Julian immediately. The Ashcroft boy, always a step removed from the rest of the town, always watched but never truly seen. She braced herself for awkwardness, for the subtle reminder of all that separated them. But Julian, sensing her hesitation, offered a tentative smile, one that did not carry the weight of expectation, but rather the gentleness of someone reaching across a divide. "Sorry," he said quietly, his voice low and even. "I didn't mean to startle you." Clara managed a nod, her fingers tightening around the book she held. "It's all right, I just didn't see you there." Their words were simple, but beneath them ran a current of curiosity and uncertainty. In that small, cluttered shop, with the rain whispering against the glass and the scent of old paper hanging sweetly in the air, something shifted, an invisible thread connecting two lives that until now had only circled each other from a distance. As they stood together, the world outside faded into a blur of grey and gold, and for the first time, both Clara and Julian felt the possibility of something unexpected, a story waiting to be written if only they dared to turn the page. Julian's hand hovered awkwardly over the worn wooden counter, the faintest tremor betraying his composure before he pulled it back to his side. Clara, still holding the tattered volume of poetry, found herself searching for words that might fill the hush between them. Outside, the rain continued its soft percussion, blurring the world into watercolor as if time itself had slowed to watch them. "Do you come here often?" Julian asked, his tone gentle, almost tentative, as though afraid his presence might shatter the fragile peace of the moment. Clara hesitated, then offered a small, honest smile. "Whenever I can. The shop feels different from everywhere else, like the world pauses for a bit." Her voice was low, colored by something wistful that she rarely allowed herself to show. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her gaze flicking over the spines of books stacked like sleeping cats upon the shelves. Julian nodded, understanding more than he let on. "It's my first time," he confessed, glancing around as if seeing the place through her eyes. "I've always walked past, but today, I don't know. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet." He paused, almost embarrassed by his own admission. "It's harder than it looks, isn't it? Finding quiet, I mean." Clara let out a soft, almost imperceptible laugh, the sound delicate as the flutter of a bird's wing. "The world doesn't seem to want to give it to us easily," she agreed, "but it's worth looking for." For a moment, they stood together in the hush, broken only by the distant murmur of the shopkeeper behind his desk and the rain's persistent song. The warmth of the lamplight curled around them, softening the edges of their uncertainty. Olá, linda alma romântica! Antes de começarmos nossa história de hoje, convido você a se inscrever e curtir para que possamos continuar compartilhando essas histórias emocionantes juntos. E me diga nos comentários: De que canto do mundo você está ouvindo esta noite? Julian's gaze lingered on Clara, noting the fine lines of concentration on her brow, the way her fingers rested protectively on the faded cover of her book. He realized, with a quiet surge of surprise, that he envied her certainty in this small sanctuary, a certainty he had never felt in any of his father's echoing rooms. He cleared his throat, searching for a thread to keep the fragile connection alive. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in her hands. Clara's cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and shyness. "It's poetry," she said, her thumb tracing the embossed letters on the cover. "I like the way words can say something without saying it outright. Like how a feeling can sit between the lines, waiting for you to notice it." Julian smiled, the gesture slow and genuine. "I think I understand. Sometimes it's easier to feel things in silence than in words." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of loneliness perhaps, or of longing. Outside, the rain softened, the sound tapering off until only a gentle dripping remained. A voice called out from the back of the shop, and Clara glanced over her shoulder. "I should go," she said quietly, regret slipping into her tone. "My mother will be waiting. She worries." Julian nodded, but the thought of her leaving left a hollowness in his chest. He fought the urge to reach out, to ask her to stay a moment longer, but the words tangled in his throat. Clara tucked the book beneath her arm and offered him a parting smile, one that flickered with uncertainty and hope in equal measure. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He watched her walk away, the bell above the door chiming softly in her wake. The air seemed colder in her absence, the lamplight suddenly less golden. Julian stood for a moment longer, absorbing the silence she left behind, before stepping out into the cobblestone street. The world outside greeted him with the scent of wet earth and lingering bread from the nearby bakery. The sky was painted with the last streaks of dusk, clouds drifting lazily in shades of violet and grey. Julian walked slowly, hands deep in his coat pockets, replaying the fragments of conversation in his mind. He wondered what it would be like to move through the world as Clara did, with purpose, with a sense of belonging that was not dependent on the size of one's home or the weight of one's name. His own life, for all its comforts, felt hollowed by rituals performed out of duty instead of desire. The grand house he returned to each evening echoed with the voices of the past, his father's measured commands, his mother's distant affection, none of which seemed to penetrate the cold marble floors. Clara's walk home led her along the edge of the river, its current swollen from the rain. The lamplight shimmered on the water, dancing with the reflection of passing clouds. She let her steps slow, breathing in the cool air tinged with the promise of autumn. In her hands, the poetry book felt heavier, as though it carried not just words, but the memory of a meeting that had unsettled something deep within her. Her mother's cottage was small, the paint peeling in places, but the windows glowed with warmth from within. Clara paused at the gate, listening to the distant laughter of children and the sharp bark of a dog before pushing open the door. Inside, the scent of chamomile tea and fresh linens wrapped around her like a soft blanket. Her mother, Greta, sat in her usual chair by the hearth, knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. She looked up as Clara entered, her eyes bright with expectation. "You're late, darling," Greta chided gently, setting her work aside. "I was beginning to worry." Clara shrugged off her coat, hanging it by the door. "I lost track of time in the bookshop. It was raining." Greta's gaze softened. "You always did love the rain. Did you find something special?" Clara hesitated, then nodded, holding up the book. "Poetry. I suppose I needed something beautiful tonight." Greta smiled, reaching out to squeeze her daughter's hand. "You have a poet's heart, Clara. Your father used to say that too." The mention of her father sent a pang through Clara's chest, a familiar ache that never quite dulled with time. She squeezed her mother's hand in return, grateful for the unspoken comfort that passed between them. Later, as Clara lay in her small attic room, listening to the wind whispering against the window pane, she found her thoughts drifting back to Julian. She remembered the way his eyes had softened when he spoke of silence, the way his voice carried both confidence and hesitation. There was a gentleness in him she had not expected, a vulnerability that mirrored her own secret fears. She wondered what it might be like to share her world with someone like him, to let another person peer into the corners of her solitude. The thought both thrilled and frightened her, stirring a restlessness that would not be soothed by poetry alone. Across town, Julian sat at his father's dinner table, the crystal glasses and silver cutlery catching the light of the chandelier above. The conversation was stilted, dominated by talk of production quotas and labor disputes. His father, Augustine, spoke in clipped sentences, his face set in the stern lines of command. "You must take more responsibility at the factory, Julian," Augustine said, his fork pausing mid-air. "There's talk of unrest again. The men need to see your presence." Julian nodded absently, his mind wandering to the bookshop, to Clara's quiet smile and the dust motes swirling in the lamplight. He wondered if she ever felt so out of place among her own people as he did among his. His mother, Sabine, watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. "You hardly eat anymore," she observed softly, her voice a counterpoint to Augustine's. "Is something troubling you?" He shook his head, masking his thoughts behind a polite smile. "Just tired, Mother. Long day." But as the meal dragged on, Julian felt the gulf between his family's expectations and his own heart widening. He excused himself early, seeking solace in the quiet of the garden outside. The scent of roses lingered in the damp air, mingling with the sharper tang of iron from the factory beyond the hedgerow. He closed his eyes, letting the night settle around him, and imagined a different life, a life where words mattered more than titles, where connection was forged not through obligation but through understanding. He imagined Clara's laughter, echoing through the empty halls of his home, filling the spaces left hollow by years of formality and restraint. The following days passed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Clara returned to her work at the textile mill, her hands moving deftly over the machines as the sun filtered through the high windows. The hum of looms and the chatter of her co-workers created a familiar symphony, but her mind wandered often to the memory of Julian, to the questions his presence had awakened. Sometimes at the end of her shift, she would catch sight of him across the square, his figure unmistakable in its quiet dignity, his gaze searching the crowd for something or someone he could not name. They exchanged brief nods, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary that separated their worlds. One afternoon, as golden light spilled through the clouds and painted the town in honeyed hues, Clara found herself drawn once more to the bookshop. She entered quietly, hoping to lose herself in stories and verses, but instead found Julian seated in the far corner, a book open on his lap. He looked up as she approached, a hesitant smile crossing his lips. "I hoped you might come," he admitted, his voice softer than before. "I wanted to thank you for reminding me that quiet places still exist." Clara sat beside him, careful to keep a respectful distance, her heart beating a little faster than usual. "Sometimes it's easier to find quiet with someone else," she replied, her words tentative but sincere. They spoke for a long while, sharing thoughts about books and dreams, each revealing more than they intended in the gentle ebb and flow of conversation. Julian confessed his frustrations with the life he was expected to lead, his longing for something more than duty and tradition. Clara, in turn, spoke of her fears for her mother's health, her uncertainty about the future, and the ache of wanting something she could not name. Their exchanges became a ritual in the weeks that followed, a meeting of kindred spirits in the sanctuary of old pages and whispered hopes. They learned to read the silences between their words, to recognize the flicker of longing in each other's eyes. Yet beneath the surface of their growing intimacy, a current of doubt persisted. Clara worried that their connection was a fragile thing, easily broken by the realities of their different worlds. She saw the way people looked at them when they walked together through the market, the curious glances, the whispered remarks that lingered like smoke. Julian, too, felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He knew his father would never approve of a match with the worker's daughter, that the lines drawn by society were not so easily erased. Still, he could not bring himself to let go of the hope that, together, they might find a way to bridge the distance. One evening, as the first chill of winter crept into the air, and the stars emerged one by one above the rooftops, Julian reached for Clara's hand as they strolled along the riverbank. The touch was tentative at first, a question asked in silence. When she did not pull away, he drew a breath of relief, feeling the warmth of her fingers steady the tremor in his own. They paused beneath a willow tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink around them, holding its breath. "I don't know what happens next," Julian admitted, his voice rough with vulnerability. "But I want to find out. With you." Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. "I'm afraid," she whispered, her confession hanging between them like mist, "but I think I'd regret it even more if I let that stop me." In the hush that followed, their hands remained entwined, and the river carried their unspoken promises downstream, weaving a fragile thread of possibility through the heart of the town. The days that followed settled into a soft, uncertain rhythm, as if the town itself sensed the delicate newness blooming between Clara and Julian. Each morning, the air carried the scent of dew and coal smoke, and the golden hush before sunrise seemed to hold the memory of hands intertwined beneath the willow. Yet beneath this hopeful quiet, the world around them continued its relentless spin, pulling them into currents neither fully understood. Clara moved through her days with a heightened awareness, each movement echoing the feel of Julian's fingers in hers. The clatter of dishes in her small kitchen, her mother's gentle humming, the familiar ache in her shoulders after hours at the factory, all these ordinary things seemed at once unchanged and irreversibly altered. Sometimes, when she stood by the window watching the lamplighters at dusk, she would catch herself smiling at nothing in particular, a warmth fluttering behind her ribs. But alongside that warmth, doubts gathered like clouds on the horizon. The town, small and close-knit as it was, had eyes everywhere. Whispers seemed to rise from the cracks in the cobblestones, winding their way through alleyways and across the market square. Clara felt them in the lingering glances of her co-workers, in the sudden hush that fell when she entered the bakery, in the way her name was spoken, softly, speculatively, as if she were not quite herself anymore, but a character in someone else's story. Julian, meanwhile, found himself adrift in the grand, echoing spaces of his family's house. The polished wood gleamed in the late afternoon sun, and the ticking of the ornate clock resounded with a new, hollow urgency. He tried to lose himself in his father's ledgers and the endless correspondence that arrived each day. But numbers and words blurred before his eyes. His thoughts drifted back again and again to the willow's shadow, to Clara's hesitant laugh, to the way her eyes softened when she was caught off guard. He longed to see her, to hear her voice, yet he hesitated, uncertain of the lines he might be crossing, uncertain even of himself. The weight of expectation pressed on his shoulders, his father's stern gaze, his mother's gentle reminders to remember who you are, the knowledge that the comfort he'd always known was built on the labor of families like Clara's. These truths, long ignored, now felt jagged and unavoidable. Their meetings became a secret thread woven through the fabric of their days. Sometimes it was only a fleeting encounter in the bookshop, where their hands brushed as they reached for the same volume. Other times it was a quiet walk by the river, boots scraping against the gravel, their conversation drifting from books and music to dreams half-spoken. Each moment was precious, suspended between hope and fear. One late afternoon, as the first hint of winter crept into the air, Clara waited for Julian by the old railway bridge. The clouds were gathering, heavy and low, and a chill wind tugged at her scarf. She stood with her hands pressed deep in her pockets, heart drumming with anticipation and anxiety. When Julian arrived, breathless from hurrying, she saw the worry etched in his brow before he even spoke. "There's talk," he said, voice low, glancing over his shoulder as if the shadows themselves might be listening. "People are asking questions about us." Clara's chest tightened. "I know," she replied, her words barely more than a whisper. "I hear them too." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back, needing air, needing space to think. The sound of distant laughter floated from the town, mingling with the restless rustle of dry leaves. She tried to steady her breathing, her mind running through every implication. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the rawness of the question. Julian's face softened and he shook his head. "No, I could never regret knowing you, being with you. But I hate that it's so hard, that it has to be a secret." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the low moan of the wind through the girders. Clara wanted to reach for him, to draw comfort from his presence, but a stubborn, frightened part of her held back. "It's always been this way," she said quietly, lines drawn between us even before we met. "Sometimes I wonder if we're only pretending they don't matter." Julian looked down, shame coloring his cheeks. "I don't want them to matter, not to me. But I know that for people like my father, they always will." A bitter smile flickered at Clara's lips. "And for people like my mother, too. She worries, you know. About me, about what I could lose." The sky darkened and a few fat raindrops splattered against the stone. Without thinking, Julian slipped off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She let him, her resolve wavering in the face of his kindness. "I just want you to be happy," he murmured, his hand lingering on her arm. Even if it isn't with me." She blinked back sudden tears, the ache of longing and the sting of regret tangling inside her. "I want you to be happy too. But I don't know how to do that, not when everything feels so uncertain." The rain picked up, a steady patter that blurred the world into soft edges. They walked together in silence, the air thick with things unsaid. When they reached the fork in the path, one way leading back to the heart of town, the other toward the looming silhouette of Julian's house, they stopped. "Maybe we need to step back," Clara said, voice trembling. "Let things settle. Give the town less to talk about." Julian closed his eyes, struggling to steady his breath. "If that's what you want." She shook her head, wiping at her cheeks. "It's not what I want, but maybe it's what we need." He nodded, his own pain mirrored in her expression. They parted with only a brief, trembling touch, a promise left unfinished. The days that followed were heavy with absence. For Clara, the hours stretched long and empty, her mother's gentle questions and worried glances more piercing than ever. She tried to fill the hollow space with work, with chores, with books whose words slipped through her mind like water. Each night, she lay awake, replaying every conversation, every touch, every faltering laugh. The ache of separation settled in her bones, a constant thrum beneath her skin. She found herself haunted by memories, Julian's smile in the golden light, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, the warmth of his hand over hers. Regret gnawed at her, mingling with resentment, at the town, at the stubbornness of old wounds, at her own fear. Julian, too, was adrift. He moved through his days like a shadow, his father's voice echoing in the corridors, his mother's gentle concern another weight he struggled to bear. He missed Clara with a fierceness that surprised him. He missed the way she challenged him, the way her laughter broke through his reserve, the way she looked at him as if he were someone worth loving. He wandered the empty rooms of his house, pausing by the window to watch the world outside. He saw the workers streaming to the factory at dawn, their breath rising in clouds, their faces set with determination and fatigue. He wondered if Clara was among them, and whether she spared a thought for him as she passed beneath the lamplight. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Julian sat at his desk, pen in hand, a blank sheet before him. He tried to write, letters to Clara, apologies to himself, confessions he could not speak aloud. The words stubbornly refused to come, and he stared out at the swirling flakes, feeling the ache of emptiness deepen. That night, he wandered through the silent house, ending up in the garden behind the kitchen. The world was hushed, the snow muffling every sound. He stood beneath the bare branches of the old chestnut tree, heart pounding, breath hanging in icy clouds. He remembered the taste of hope, the feel of Clara's hand in his, and he wondered if he would ever feel whole again. For Clara, the breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning. The church bells chimed through the crisp air, and she sat by the window, watching the snow melt in slow rivulets down the glass. Her mother sat nearby, knitting in silence, her eyes flicking to Clara with quiet concern. After a long pause, her mother spoke. "You seem far away lately, Clara. Is something troubling you?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "Just tired, I suppose. Things at work have been difficult." Her mother's hands stilled, the needles clicking together softly. "It's not the work, is it? You can talk to me, you know." Clara looked down at her hands, strong, calloused, trembling. "I don't know what to say. I thought I could have something just for myself, something good. But it feels like the world won't let me." Her mother reached across the table, taking her hand in both of hers. "The world is always quick to judge, my love. But the world doesn't have to live your life. You do. Tears slid down Clara's cheeks, silent and unbidden. She squeezed her mother's hand, the warmth a small comfort in the storm inside her. "Do you think it's foolish," she whispered, "to want something different?" Her mother smiled, sadness and pride mingling in her eyes. "I think it's brave. And I think sometimes brave things hurt. But that doesn't mean they're not worth it." Clara nodded, the words settling deep within her. That night she lay awake, the memory of her mother's voice echoing in her heart. She realized that love, real love, was not measured by what others whispered, but by the courage to reach for what made her feel alive. Across town, Julian reached his own quiet reckoning. Alone in his father's study, surrounded by relics of a life built on certainty, he finally understood that happiness could not be won by following someone else's path. His longing for Clara was not a weakness, but a calling, one he could no longer ignore. As the days crept toward the end of winter, both carried their pain and hope like talismans, uncertain of what the future held, but unwilling to surrender the memory of what they had shared. The town, for all its watchfulness, could not erase the truth that had taken root in their hearts. Each, in their own solitude, began to imagine a world in which love did not have to hide. And so, as the first crocuses pushed bravely through the thawing earth, a fragile sense of possibility bloomed again, quiet, insistent, waiting for the moment when hope might find its voice. Spring arrived in the small industrial town, not with a grand flourish, but with quiet persistence. The air, once sharp and cold, now carried the promise of renewal, a whisper of warmth that coaxed green buds from the stark branches lining the cobblestone streets. The factories still hummed in the distance, but their rhythm felt gentler beneath the chorus of birdsong that returned each morning. Children's laughter mingled with the scent of fresh bread as shopkeepers swept dust from their thresholds, and the river, once sluggish under sheets of ice, danced again in the sunlight. Clara felt the change most keenly on her morning walks to the bakery. The world seemed softer, as though the town itself were waking from a long, restless sleep. Yet inside her a quiet ache remained, a longing that colored each moment with memory. She moved through her days with determined grace, caring for her mother and tending the small garden behind their cottage, her hands deep in the earth. But sometimes, when the wind caught her hair or the sun warmed her face just so, she would close her eyes and feel again the gentle press of Julian's hand against hers, the echo of laughter in the old bookshop, the fragile hope that had once bloomed between them. She had not seen Julian since that day in late winter, when their worlds had pulled them apart. Rumors had ebbed and flowed with the changing season. Whispers about the owner's son, his sudden withdrawal from the social gatherings, the arguments heard through the tall iron gates of the house on the hill. Clara tried not to listen, but gossip traveled on the same currents as the spring breeze, finding its way under doors and through open windows. Each story stung, not for what was said, but for the reminder of what was lost. In the quiet moments after sunset, she would sit by her window and watch the last light fade over the rooftops. The sky, streaked with lavender and rose, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something unnamed. It was in these silences that Clara allowed herself to remember, not just the pain of their parting, but the truth of what they'd shared. She thought of Julian's earnest eyes, the way he had listened to her with a tenderness she had never known before. She wondered if he too was haunted by memories, if he felt the same slow ache in his chest each time he passed the bookshop or heard the distant whistle of the factory. Julian, for his part, had retreated into the quiet corners of his father's house. The walls, once imposing and cold, now felt suffocating, a prison of expectation and regret. He moved through the echoing halls with a heaviness that no amount of sunlight could lift. His father's disappointment lingered in every conversation, a shadow that grew longer each day. Yet Julian found himself unable to care about the family business, the meetings, or the carefully planned future laid out before him. None of it mattered, not since Clara. He filled his evenings with long walks along the riverbank, seeking solace in the changing landscape. The water, restless and bright, mirrored the turmoil within him. Sometimes he would pause and watch the clouds drift across the sky, wondering if Clara was looking at the same horizon. His heart carried her name in every beat, a refrain both sweet and unbearable. He replayed their conversations in his mind, the laughter, the hesitation, the warmth that had sparked between them, and then been so cruelly extinguished. One afternoon, as April drifted toward May, a letter arrived for Clara. Its envelope thick and creamy, her name written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. She hesitated before opening it, her breath shallow with anticipation and dread. Inside, the words were simple, formal almost, but beneath their careful structure ran a current of hope. Miss Clara, I write not knowing if this will reach you, or if you will wish to receive it at all. Still, I find myself compelled by the thought that some words, once spoken, cannot be unsaid, and that silence, though it may protect the heart, can also wound it more deeply. There are things I wish I had told you, things I wish I had not allowed pride or fear to silence. If you can find it in your heart to meet with me once more, I would be grateful, if only to hear your voice and offer my own truth. Should you wish to see me, I will wait by the old willow near the river at dusk this Saturday. Yours sincerely, Julian. Clara read the letter twice, her hands trembling. The urge to refuse, to protect herself from disappointment, warred with a deeper longing she could not quiet. She remembered the old willow, its branches trailing into the water like a curtain, the place where she had often gone as a child to dream of other worlds. Now it called to her with a different promise, a chance however slight to mend what had been broken. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and doubt. Clara found herself glancing at the clock, measuring time by heartbeats. She rehearsed what she might say, then abandoned the words, knowing that nothing she could prepare would capture the tangle of hope and fear within her. On Saturday, as the sun dipped low in the sky, she dressed with care, not for vanity, but as a small act of courage. She walked through the town, her steps slow and deliberate, each breath steadying her resolve. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of damp earth and new leaves as she reached the riverbank. The willow stood as it always had, its silhouette silvered by the twilight. Julian was already there, his figure outlined against the water, hands clasped behind his back. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression uncertain but open. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the space between them heavy with everything unspoken. The river murmured at their feet, and the breeze stirred the willow branches, weaving shadows across their faces. "Thank you for coming," Julian said, his voice soft. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "I almost didn't." "I know." He hesitated, searching her face as though trying to read the story of their months apart. "I've thought of you every day. I wanted to write sooner, but I was afraid you wouldn't want to hear from me." A long silence settled between them. Clara felt the old instinct to guard her heart, to turn away before she could be hurt again. But in the hush of the evening, with the world softened by twilight, she found herself letting go. "Why did you ask me here?" she whispered. "After everything?" Julian took a step closer, the distance between them narrowing. "Because I was wrong, about so many things. I let fear of my father, of the town, of not being enough, keep me from saying what I felt. I thought I had to choose between the life I was given and the life I wanted, but neither means anything without you." Clara's breath caught. The longing in Julian's eyes was raw, unguarded, a mirror to her own. She felt the ache in her chest soften, replaced by something fragile and bright. "I was angry," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought you'd chosen your world over me. I thought I'd been a fool to dream." He reached for her hand, hesitant at first, then surer as her fingers curled into his. "You were never a fool, Clara. Not for loving, not for hoping. You taught me what it means to be brave." The river seemed to hush, as though listening. Clara felt the warmth of Julian's touch seep into her, melting the last of the winter's chill. They stood together beneath the willow, the town's distant lights flickering to life behind them. "I don't know what happens now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't change who we are. The world may not make it easy." Julian smiled, gentle, resolute. "No, we can't change who we are. But we can decide what matters. I don't want a life shaped by fear or by someone else's expectations. I want a life that's honest, even if it's difficult. I want you." The words, simple and unadorned, settled over her like a benediction. Clara felt something inside her loosen, a knot of grief and doubt giving way to hope. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than loss. They talked as night fell, voices mingling with the chorus of frogs and the rustle of leaves. They spoke of dreams and disappointments, of mistakes forgiven and wounds that would take time to heal. There were no grand promises, no declarations of forever, only the quiet certainty that they were stronger together than apart. As the moon rose silver and full, Julian brushed a stray curl from Clara's cheek. She looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the soft light. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely more than breath. She nodded, her heart fluttering like a bird in her chest. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle, hesitant at first, then deepening with all the tenderness and longing they had carried through the long winter. It was not a promise of happily ever after, just a promise of now, of this moment, of a new beginning. When they parted, Clara rested her head against Julian's shoulder, the steady beat of his heart, a comfort against the uncertainty that still lingered. Together they watched the moonlight play on the water, the world around them hushed and shimmering with possibility. In the days that followed, their relationship bloomed quietly, away from prying eyes and whispered judgments. They met in hidden corners and sunlit clearings, building a world of their own within the boundaries of the town. It was not always easy. There were moments of doubt, of fear, of old wounds reopening. But there was also laughter and kindness and the slow weaving of trust. Clara's mother, frail but wise, saw the change in her daughter's eyes and welcomed Julian with a gentle nod, recognizing in him the same longing for connection that had shaped her own life. Julian's father, for his part, remained distant, but the power of his disapproval seemed to wane as he saw his son's quiet happiness. The town, too, began to soften, its judgments diluted by the passage of time and the quiet resilience of love. The seasons turned, and with them the rhythms of life. The factory's whistle still echoed each morning, but now it was joined by the laughter of children and the music of hope. Clara and Julian walked hand in hand through the changing landscape, their hearts open to whatever the future might bring. On a warm summer night, as fireflies danced in the fields and the scent of night jasmine drifted through the air, they returned to the willow by the river. There, beneath the gentle glow of stars, they spoke softly of dreams yet to be dreamed, of a life shaped not by fear but by the quiet courage of love. And as the river flowed on, restless, enduring, they knew that whatever storms might come, they had found in each other a home, not perfect, not without sorrow, but steadfast and true, a light in the darkness, a hope that would carry them through all the seasons of their days.